Bob, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
I can hear you fine. I'm going to keep my mic off
Yeah, okay,
after we get started.
okay. So I guess if we hear a little really loud crash in the middle of the presentation, it means you got so involved in it that you took your eyes off the road.
No, I'm not driving.
Okay.
I'm driving, but it's noisy in the car and other people are talking, so I'm going to keep it mute.
Okay.
Hello, Emily.
Yeah.
Emily's on mute, so.
Oh yeah, I was muted because I'm outside with Noah, so I figured he might start fussing or crying or what have you. But don't worry, I will unmute because when I have questions, will happily participate.
Okay. Well, I'm
All right.
glad you're here.
But I am
Yes, me too.
happily.
I talked to Scott Duncan. He's planning on being at the meeting.
Good.
He's in another meeting right now, so he said he may have to leave. They're in the process in his company of furloughing a bunch of people, and it's not a happy time for him.
Boy, my goodness.
He's hoping to take off from 3 to 4. So
Okay.
in a meeting like that, I would think he would need a break. Hey, Emily, is today your due date?
What was that, Bob?
Is today your due date?
Oh no, Thursday is.
Okay.
But we got no signs. Looking pretty
No, it's not.
normal over here.
I know.
Did you ask me another question, Bob?
Oh,
Well, it's 3 o'clock. You think Scott's going to come in a little bit late?
yeah, I've got 2:58.
Okay.
And mine is whatever they call that, atomic time.
Yeah.
Just give it
I
a few
think-
minutes.
Okay.
I sent out a whole bunch of invitations. So. bag on it. Probably the used car on it. I think that's the market. You want to go ahead and open in prayer, David?
Okay. Father God, I thank you for your creation. I thank you for the mysteries that you've provided for us and the puzzles that you expect us to work out and the parables of life. And Lord, I ask that you would help us to understand how you would prefer in your plan for us to go through difficulties and trials. And Lord, I was just reading in Oswald Chambers this morning about how he really felt sorry for Christians who were not in circumstances that they would rather not be in. And Lord, help us to understand that circumstances, like I was just thinking about how horrible it is to have your job terminated for no reason, that for you haven't done anything wrong, and how sad that is for families and what a struggle it is to take steps backward. But Lord, I know that when you have ordained that we take a step backward, it's only backward from our perspective, and that it's from your perspective, if we obey you, it's always forward. I love you, Lord. I ask you to bless our hearts and our minds as we struggle through these logical issues today that have caused so much strife and struggle amongst Christians and between Christians themselves and between Christians and the world. Lord, help us to think clearly about these things. You've asked us to come reason with you, and so we need to know how to do that and to understand how to think clearly through these issues. And so I love you, Lord, and I ask you to bless us with an awareness of your presence and clear thinking as we go through this. In Jesus' name, amen. Scott, good. So I'm going to share now with share the screen here and go into the PowerPoint. Okay, so can everybody see my cursor? Bob, can you see my cursor?
I still just see you.
Oh, okay. All right. Share.
I don't see the PowerPoint yet.
There you go. Yep.
Oh, you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So just a review
Scott
a little.
has his, he doesn't have his mic on.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So Scott, anytime you want to, or Emily, just butt in. Okay. Anytime you want to. We don't have any goal on finishing this at any time, and the main objective, my main objective, is your mastery of these issues. I don't have an objective to get through this in any particular time. So interaction is good, and it helps all of us to sort of pay attention to what's going on. Okay, so here we talked about the combatants that are often in this. It's usually creationists and evolutionists, and the battle, as we'll see here, is an unnecessary battle, but it requires that that we understand the nature of scientific information and investigation. So here we talked about some of the misleading words that scientists use. They don't do it on purpose. They don't use them, to deceive. It's just unfortunate that they use it this way. It makes it very difficult for us to understand the nature of science when we're using words like supporting evidence and suggestions and so forth. The importance of skepticism and the dangers of advocacy. With skepticism, science works great to develop the most parsimonious and rational conclusions. With advocacy, which comes from focus on money, it's not science anymore. It's I'm right and you're wrong. And so right and wrong is about quarreling. And arguing is about trying to understand why two smart people have different conclusions about something. And that's the way we ought to approach all of these controversies, is first to, as Covey said, to seek first to understand and then to be understood. And then some scriptures here about arguments and quarrels and some other things to ponder here about our motives. And then who are the combatants again? And so here's where we have educators and scientists that are desiring to protect the unrestricted teaching of evolutionary theory, which is empirically based, and secular humanists who are actively challenging the Christian worldview using evolutionism. And this is not empirically based, this is a philosophy. So secular humanism is not science. It is a philosophy of life. It's a worldview. And it's based on a faithful worldview. So secular humanism is a faith structure. It's not an empirical structure. And we need to understand that. And secular humanism has a grip on Western society that is almost permanent. I mean, it's just really difficult to deal with, but it is a faith-based worldview, and it is pervasive in the education systems, and it's even in many Christian education systems. And then differing origin stories. We're familiar with many of these. We'll get to talking in more detail about this toward the end of the presentation. And then we get into the evolutionists. Okay, so when we speak of evolutionists, there are really two philosophical types of evolutionists. Objective scientists, and they seek the most parsimonious explanation of what is observed. In other words, what is the easiest way to explain this from a natural history point of view? That's what parsimonious means, the least complicated explanation. Now, objective scientists that are evolutionists, that is, that are teaching evolution, would give up evolutionary theory as their model if a more parsimonious origins model emerged. So you see what I'm saying here? True scientists are compelled to give up theories that they've held that are no longer the most parsimonious theory. So should it happen that there are better, more parsimonious explanations, and parsimony also includes the least amount of exceptions to the rule. Okay, so this is an important thing to understand. If somebody refuses to consider giving up evolutionary theory, what does that mean? It's not a theory anymore. It's a worldview. And it's a philosophy, and it's not science. Okay, so Um, and then there's atheistic scientists, and I have both of these in my department here, in my biology department. Some of them are atheists, and they want to demonstrate that there is no God, and they use evolution as a prop for that. They defend the evolutionary model as truth. So we had a scientist come here several years ago, a fellow named Cohen, unfortunately a Jewish name, and the title of his book was "Why Evolution is the Truth," and he gave one of the best explanations of why evolutionary theory is a valid theory that I've ever seen. And then he proceeded, this is a big talk over in our big theater at Alkick Theater, and then proceeded to say that now I want to get to the real reason why I'm here. And that is to get Christianity completely out of the public education system. Okay, now what does that have to do with science? See that? So this is where he was. And so he was in this atheistic scientist group. He was not somebody who is seeking the most parsimonious explanation, because his objective was to eliminate the teachings of Christian teachings.
So, Dr.
So,
Huffman,
yeah.
so that second bullet point you have on there, previous slide, but the second bullet point that you had on there, where it says would give up evolutionary model, that is the pure scientist who would follow the evidence where it leads.
That's right.
I think
that's right.
In journalism, you would say follow the truth where it leads, or in law, you would say follow the truth where it leads. But in science, you would say follow the evidence where it leads. No matter which direction it points, if it's pointing one way or the other, that's the way you have to go.
That's right.
Is that correct?
That is absolutely well put. And now, it's also important for us to realize that, for instance, and I'll get to this in a little bit, that when Charles Darwin was in the Galapagos, he was not there as an atheist. He was there as a believer. Now, Charles Darwin was not, he was a universalist, okay? But universalism back then was actually believers. And, they just had a different view of salvation and so forth. But I have read the letters that Darwin wrote back, and these are available online. The letters that Darwin wrote back to his wife. And it was very, very clear that he was a profoundly devout believer. All right, so when he was in the Galapagos, he was not trying to disprove creation theory. He was seeing stuff over there that was inconsistent with the Genesis story
Dr.
of
Huffman,
creation.
I think you might have muted yourself, maybe?
Did I? Am I muted?
Oh, now you're okay. All the last I heard was it was very, very. The letters to Darwin back to his wife, and you said it was very, very, and then it cut out.
Oh, it was very obvious that Darwin was a believer at the time, and when he was doing these investigations, and the theories that he came up with, say, well, he was seeing rocks, okay, and he was seeing islands separated in different types of variation, and he was trying to explain this based on natural phenomena. And the conclusions that he was coming to were very logical, rational conclusions. And he was not guided by anything except parsimony. And he was trying to come up with the most reasonable explanation for how these things could have come about. And he didn't have this agenda of either trying to support creation, the Genesis account of creation, or reject it, or, and be antithetical to it. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but that is absolutely right, Scott, that a true scientist would give up evolutionary model if a more parsimonious model of origins were to emerge from the data. So true scientists deal with data that's derived from the empirical realm, from the physical realm, and we study this data looking for patterns, and we are compelled to accept the most parsimonious explanation that we can come up with to explain the patterns that we're seeing. Now, that doesn't mean that patterns are real, but it means it's the most parsimonious explanation we have at the moment. But later on, now the interesting thing is, if we share that idea by publishing it, other people will say, well, I don't know about that. I'm going to check and see. So they run experiments to see if they can duplicate our experiments. And so they copy our experimental design, and maybe they come up with the same answers. And so they say, or the same type of patterns. And they say, well, as far as I know, this looks like a reasonable conclusion. That doesn't make it any more of a right conclusion in terms of being real. It's just the most parsimonious explanation that we have at the moment. Now, the whole group of scientists in this field can come to that same conclusion. And then somebody steps up and says, wait a minute, I just thought of something. We're not considering da-da-da-da-da. And everybody says, well, lo and behold, I never thought of that. So then they go back and they look at this thing again, and they realize that there's another way of interpreting the data that they had not considered. Bob, your mic is on. I think, I asked Bob if he was going to be driving while he was doing this. He's not, he's in his car. Bob's in his car and is not comfortable in his den at home there. So, okay. So
yes, I'm going to get muted as soon as I can find it here.
Okay. All right. So now naturalism is a philosophy, and it's not a theory. So naturalism is not science. Naturalism is a worldview. And so I can be a Christian and investigate natural phenomena from a naturalistic perspective without being a proponent of naturalism. So I study natural history, and this is called, so I'm referred to as a naturalist because I study the natural history of organisms. But that doesn't mean I'm an advocate of naturalism, which is a philosophy. So naturalism can neither be tested by science nor supported by science. So see, we can't use science to either support or reject a philosophy. So philosophies don't have anything to do, they're just ways of interpreting and seeing the world. And now, here's another thing that we need to be aware of. You see, I have been to conferences. I was at a creationism conference in California with Dave Ness, who is a missionary to Texas State from Crew. And he took me out there, and there was a lot of people there that were scientists and that were Christians, and they were supporting creation science, so-called creation science. And they were talking, their main focus was trying to discredit Darwinism. Okay, and there's this idea going around in Christian circles that Darwinism is equivalent to evolution. And if we can just get rid of Darwinism, we can get rid of evolutionary theory. And that's really not true. So one of the main arguments that Christians have against evolutionary theory is the organic aspects of evolutionary theory. And you hear statements like, well, my granddaddy was not a monkey, and that sort of thing. So those are different. Those are two different things. And hopefully we'll see this a little more clearly as we go along. So let's look at this slide here. Can everybody see this slide I'm highlighting here? Okay. So evolutionary dogma has two components. It has the story or narrative. So when you hear me talking about narrative, I'm talking about a story. It's a story of an unfolding universe, and organic evolution is only a small part of that story. It's explanations, and then the other component is explanations of how this story may have come about. So we have the narrative and we have mechanisms. So those are two components. Darwinism, natural selection, is a mechanism proposed to explain how the patterns Darwin saw could have come about in species, in organic evolution. But dismissing Darwinism will not threaten the evolutionary narrative. So the evolutionary narrative will still be there. Now, there are many aspects of Darwinism today that we know are not working the way Darwin thought they did. Okay, so the evolutionary, the understanding of these mechanisms is an evolving thing itself, and they'll continue to evolve. We're never going to reach the truth about these things. We just, so as the understanding of evolutionary theory evolves and advances, we're not getting any closer to the truth, but we're just incorporating new data that is coming in and new perspectives on how to look at this data. So that's where that comes from. And there, for instance, in mechanisms, there are theories of speciation. So different groups, apparently, the evolutionary narrative has different groups being speciated by different mechanisms. So now, you may not know this, but many species have been recreated in the lab from previous species. And so in the Bible, people go back to the word kind that's in the Bible, and they equate this with species. But that's not really, the species concept was not a concept until like the 1800s, where we had a reasonable scientific explanation for the term species. So speciation is a form of microevolution. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking you through some of the components of evolutionary theory so that we can understand what we're dealing with here. So speciation is a form of microevolution. There are many proposed mechanisms. Some have been tested extensively in lab experiments, and others can't be tested directly. They can only be conjectured and then tested sort of indirectly. And so the evolution of major groups like amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and stuff is macroevolution and remains enigmatic. Remains enigmatic. What does that mean? It's still a puzzle. We don't have really good parsimonious theories that enjoy wide agreement in the scientific community about how major groups of animals and plants could have occurred. We don't have mechanisms. We don't have mechanisms. We have a narrative, but we don't have mechanisms to support it. Now, here is a caveat. This is something that is often ignored in the Christian communities that are dealing with this scientific creationism. Failure to explain with acceptable mechanism does not threaten the evolutionary narrative. That's really important to understand. So there's this concept called God of the gaps, the God of the gaps, GAPS. And what that refers to is God is in the things we can't explain. So, for instance, the human eye is one of those things that is, it's hard to explain a system by means of which this could have started from a more primitive, like eye-sensitive cell or a light-sensitive cell and evolved into this complex mechanism. Actually, the eye of birds would be a much more difficult thing to explain than a human eye. It's much more complicated. But see, when we do not have a satisfactory, widely acceptable, parsimonious explanation for how something could have happened, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. That is not evidence that it didn't happen, in other words. So this is a what we call a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy to conclude that because you can't explain how something happens, that it's an invalid theory or a bankrupt theory. You know, I remember I was thinking the other day, when I was a little boy, I'd get headaches, and my mom would give me an aspirin, and the headache would go away. And I thought, that is so awesome. And so I asked Mom, I said, how does that work? And she said, I don't know, let's ask Dad. So I asked Dad, how does that work? We don't know. Well, it turns out that aspirin works as a prostaglandin inhibitor. Well, I didn't know about prostaglandins when I was a kid. They discovered them, I guess, when I was in my 20s or something like that. Now there's about 60 of them or something. But anyhow, just because we couldn't explain how aspirin worked didn't mean it didn't work, that it wasn't effective. Okay, so then, now here's some creationist approaches. Creationists cite problems with Darwinism, and there are many problems with Darwinism. They use these problems to threaten the validity of the evolutionary narrative. Now here's a little ditty that you can take home with you. This is really important to remember. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So if you go looking for God, I don't know how many of you became Christians as adults. I certainly did. And I went looking for God and couldn't find him. Does that mean he doesn't exist? Well, that's what a lot of people want to conclude, but that's not evidence that he doesn't exist. I was looking for him on my terms. Not going to happen. So the God of the gaps, or what we call, there's actually a book out by a biochemist called Irreducible Complexity. And irreducible complexity is evidence of God. Well, it might be. I mean, we could use that as evidence of God, but it doesn't mean that the complexity is going to remain irreducible. So there are many things that we understand, even kids learn about in grade school today, that were absolute mysteries when their granddads were in school. And so they were irreducible at some time in the past, but now they're just common knowledge. So this is not a good strategy for supporting the Christian worldview. I mean, what is the best way to support the Christian worldview? By arguing people into a corner? You know, I think Francis Schaeffer's approach is a reasonable approach to ask people questions about their worldview and expose, this is what happened to me, except I was asking the questions myself about my worldview and backed my own self into a corner, like I was some kind of a masochist or something. But, you know, Francis Schaeffer said, you bring people to a point of despair, and then you start giving them hope about the Christian worldview. And anyhow, so this strategy puts creation science in constant retreat mode. So God is constantly retreating as more and more gaps are filled in with explanations, scientifically reasonable explanations. And it leads to, now look at this last statement here. It leads to frustrated Christians who get persecuted because they have been obnoxious. I'm sorry, but a lot of times these approaches we have they just generate, they're just abrasive, and they're not based on, the only thing that's going to convert people is the Word of God, and that's what we've got to deal with here. And being obnoxious is not going to work. And if we're going to get persecuted, it needs to be for the right reasons. So, for instance, Bruno said there's an infinite universe and there is no celestial sphere. So they used to see the sky as a celestial sphere with little pinholes in it that was going around and around. He was burned at the stake before hundreds of cheering Christians. Newton discovered that planetary orbits are not perfect, that they're ellipses. And but ellipses are not perfect circles. And so the church at the time said, well, this is just heresy. And they forced him to say that God periodically intervened to kick the planets back into perfect circular orbits. And so this is just a sampling of the kinds of things that scientists have been persecuted for by the church. And so now, getting back to science, science is always provisional. Science can never reveal truth. Science cannot even get us closer to the truth. That's really frustrating. We're not even getting closer. So I got to the point where I could understand that science can't reveal truth, but I still thought we were getting closer to the truth. And it took me a while to have to give that up as well. But the nature of science simply can never reveal truth, and it can't even get us closer to truth. Now, science cannot support a stable worldview because science is not stable. It's always changing. The narrative is always increasing in complexity. Well, except periodically the complexity reduces when there's a paradigm shift. The supporting data are always incomplete. The facts are always provisional. So these two terms, always, here, these are important, we understand. The supporting data in any scientific conclusion is incomplete. So why did we stop the study? Because if we didn't stop it, we'd get fired. That's the reason. So we have to put out a report. So we have deadlines to meet. We have quotas to meet. We actually have to get a certain number of papers published every year to keep our jobs. So we have to quit before we have all the data because we can never get all the data. And so scientific facts are always provisional. Therefore, a worldview based on science is a moving target. So this is very important part of the understanding that scientific creationism is way off base. It is not biblical and it is not scientific. So it's a misnomer on both accounts. The term in itself is self-contradictory. Now, by the way, there's another sort of movement in the Christian evangelical community called oh shoot, what is it, Bob? It's not scientific creationism, but it has to do with the wonder and the beauty of nature. And I see this all the time in in ways that y'all could not believe the things that I have seen that are just absolutely amazing. You know, I study parasites, and you might think, well, man, how could you see beauty in that? These life cycles that some of these organisms have are just absolutely mind-blowing. And so, you know, so there is another sort of parallel movement to scientific creationism that is more based on the wonder of what we see and the overall pattern that is not conflicted, that is not really in conflict with Christianity or science, and it's much more reasonable, and it's more of what?
Doctor, you're referring to intelligent design?
Yes, intelligent design. Yeah. So that's the intelligent design is a philosophy, and it's not an attempt to come up with scientific evidence that Genesis actually happened, so that we can convert Genesis from a faith structure into a theoretical structure, and so it's more logically reasonable. So a worldview based on science, you know, and Christianity is a worldview, but we don't want to base Christianity on science because it changes every day, and it's a moving target. Let's see. Okay, we still got some time here. Okay, scientific issues versus spiritual issues. Science deals with information experienced from the physical realm. Data is from the senses and extensions of senses, which are what instruments are, is extensions of our senses into orders of magnitude smaller or larger. And spiritual issues deal with supernatural. Okay, super means beyond or above natural. In other words, not natural. And metaphysical, which means after the physical or outside of the physical. They cannot be challenged by empirical analysis. Okay, so data cannot be used to challenge spiritual issues. And spiritual issues should not be supported by data analysis, because then they become scientific theories rather than philosophy or spiritual issues. So now I think I told y'all that when I go into my biometry class on the first day, I ask them, well, actually it's the second day. The first day I just talk about the nature of the course. And then the next meeting I come in and say, there's something I forgot to tell you. Because I tell them all about, I was born in West Virginia and stuff. And my daddy gave me a 22 when I was in diapers, and I was raised by a pack of wolves and a bunch of lies like that. And then I tell them that I forgot to tell you one thing about me. And I tell them I'm a Christian. And then I go into telling them what I believe and stuff. And then I tell them that I go through this stuff about believe. Do you believe in evolution? Do you believe in Genesis and stuff? And I ask them these things. And then I get back to this word belief. And evolution as science is not a belief. It is a theory. So, it's actually a collection of theories, of interrelated, interlocking theories. So it's scientific theories, not faith-based structures. It's supported and challenged only by empirical evidence, not by conviction. Faith cannot be based on data and still be faith. I think it was Augustine that said, or somebody, I forget who said it, but something like faith once justified is no longer faith. Faith once justified is no longer faith. Religions deal separately with physical and spiritual realms. Empirically supported faith is no longer faith. If faith is supported empirically, it can then be challenged empirically by new data. So remember what I said, that a true scientist who has accepted evolutionary theory, if presented with a more parsimonious explanation for the data at hand, is compelled to accept the new explanation and to give up evolution. And that puts Christianity, scientific creationism, in the same realm. So we must allow challenge, empirical challenge, and adjust our faith according to the new data. Who wants to do that? You know, so this is a really irrational approach to Christianity. Did you have a question, Emily?
Yes, sorry, my 2-year-old started crying whenever I unmuted myself. So this seems like a pretty silly question to me, but it's just like simple, I guess. And that is like, how or why do we allow science in general to direct so much of what we do if it's just constantly changing anyways? Is it because it currently fixes or supports that problem? Like right now I'm just thinking about an example like vaccines, for example. Yeah. Like I was thinking about, okay, just something that like the MMR vaccine has been out for years and years, and it has all these potential side effects, but it's the only solution. Is it only a solution because we've accepted it to be the solution because it makes most sense right now, but it can also become any other solution at some other point?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, we hear so much about vaccines and medications today with the ongoing COVID crisis. One of the things that we hear about, like for instance, chloroquine hydroxychloride, is that it works good for lupus and it works good for malaria as a malarial prevention, but it also has some antiviral properties, but it also has some cardiac associated risks, especially for patients that have arrhythmia. And so many of the people that are at high risk for COVID damage are at high risk because they have heart issues. So this gets to be a complicated mess. Now, the vaccine efforts that are underway. Now, by the way, you may have heard Dr. Fauci say, well, COVID or chloroquine has not been proven to be effective in a randomized trial. Okay, now here's what they do with a randomized trial. They get a group of subjects that are mixed subjects, mixed sexes and so forth, and they randomly split them into two groups. And they tell, so some person does this in advance and separates the people into two groups and gives them a number, and then writes those numbers down. And so one person then, or maybe two or three people, know which group each subject is in. Then they take these people that are in these two groups, and they randomly pick one or the other group to be the treatment group, and then the other group then is the control group. All right, the people that are administering the drug to these people don't know which group their subjects are in. The subjects don't know which group they're in. And the people evaluating the results of the study don't know which subjects they're in. And then at the end of the study, if the person that has the secret hasn't died, they have backups for this, then they decode the data to see if the results fell out clearly. That's called a double-blind randomized study, and it eliminates the placebo effect, and it eliminates any bias in the interpreter or any bias in the administration of the drugs and so forth. Those are very expensive experiments to run, and they have what's called a high beta error, which means a high likelihood of failing to detect something that has promise, but maybe not efficacy, that you'd want to put it on the market now. So, so what happens then is they look at the ratio of cost. It's a cost benefit analysis, Emily, that determines whether a drug's going to go to market or not. And right now you hear so many people saying, well, we need to stay in our homes because if we go out, our kids could die from this stuff because of this disease that they found in children in New York, and two or three kids or something like that have died from it. But if you look at the ratios of how many kids have been exposed and how many of them have died from this, or even gotten the symptoms of this autoimmune disease, it's much lower than how many kids that age die from the flu every single year, by orders of magnitude. But then we have the sensationalism associated with COVID that causes people to have fear. So we need to have some rational decisions that are based on cost-benefit analysis. And so science doesn't produce definitive answers. It only produces answers that have some fuzz associated with them that we cannot eliminate. Now, what Fauci wants to do is to reduce that amount of fuzz down to an acceptable level so that we know we have a good idea of what the risks are, who is put at risk by the vaccine or the drugs, and what the benefits are, how much it costs to distribute it, and all these things taken into account. So vaccines are never perfect, and they don't work for everybody, and they don't work in the same way with everybody. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it just made me think about, just, I guess, just science in general, from everything that you've talked about with creationism and evolutionism and Darwinism and all that kind of stuff. Just like, it's kind of like, I guess people believe the evidence is factual to people because they did something that proved a theory or a concept or a fact. And then, so therefore that makes it the answer. But like you've been talking about, it's all empirically based, which means once some other new data proves that that data is incorrect or that it can be manipulated, then it changes the whole facet of the concept or fact or theory as a whole.
Yeah. So, and remember, you were with us when I was talking about scientific experiments versus or scientific facts versus mathematical facts.
Yes.
Okay. So the mathematical facts are facts that are not subject to, that are not based on empirical data and not subject to challenge by empirical data. Right. So they are not scientifically proven. Now, a lot of times the math department is in the school of science in a university. So it's sort of thought of as science because we use math in science. But science is really not, mathematics is really not science. And mathematical facts are very different from scientific facts. Mathematical facts are final. Scientific facts are never final. So I think what you're probably asking is, well, then what in the world good is science for? And that's where I had this student throw up his books in the middle of the classroom and shouted, what the hell am I doing here? Well, so here's what science is good for. Science is really good for developing systems, and systems that allow us to manipulate the physical realm in ways that we want it to be manipulated most of the time. It doesn't always work, but it gives us, most of the time, air conditioners work. You set your thermostat and it cools the house when it's hot outside, and it warms the house when it's cold outside. Okay? That doesn't work if you are in a mud hut. Okay? So you have to have technology. So the air conditioner was based on science. So Now, also understand that there's two types of people involved in air conditioning. There is the science behind it, which is pure science that is done by scientists like me. And then there's engineers that take the science and develop systems from the science. And so the HVAC is called a system. It's an air conditioning system. And it's a system that is based on scientific understanding. Now we have narratives, and we have narratives that are talked about compressed gases heat up and expanded gases, and then we have molecules banging into each other. That's all a made up story. That's a narrative that helps us to understand and be able to communicate about how to build air conditioners. And just because air conditioners work well most of the time, it doesn't mean that the narratives are true. It just means that they work. The narrative works. And so another thing science is good for is storage and retrieval of information. So, for instance, in my field, biology, we describe species. Like I have described a number of different species that were new to science. I named them, described them, and said, here's how they fit in with the overall scheme of things. Here's what they look like, and here's what they do. And so then it goes into the record. The scientific record is a new species, and becomes part of the complexity of the biological domain. And so then anytime somebody works with or discovers something about that species, it goes in a pigeonhole. So like one of those species I described was Echinorhynchus canyonensis. It's from a bass. It was a parasite of a bass, of a deep sea bass off in a canyon, deep sea canyon off California. And so there's been other papers then talking about stuff where they've got new information about Echinorhynchus canyonensis. So all that information goes into that pigeonhole called Echinorhynchus canyonensis. So then I can do a literature search on the web for Echinorhynchus canyonensis, and I can bring up all of that data. So see, it's a magnificent information storage and retrieval system. Same thing with chemical species and with new aspects of physics and astronomy and so forth. And another thing it works really good for is medicine. So all medicine is based on science, and the people that are developing vaccines and drugs for treatment, for therapeutic treatment and so forth, a lot of people for the first time have learned the difference between therapeutics versus prophylactics. And with this COVID. And so we've got drugs that are treatments for therapy, and we've got vaccines that are prophylactics. And so President Trump right now is taking chloroquine. He revealed yesterday he's been taking chloroquine for about a week and a half as a prophylactic because there were people in the White House that were exposed. All right, so the people that develop these things and test them and challenge them and so forth are sort of like medical engineers, because they're taking the science and applying it to how are we going to use this to improve life and make money at the same time. So science is really, really good for those things. It is the best way we have of developing systems, and it works really well for that. We have put this complicated Volkswagen-sized toy up on Mars that we can now run around with a joystick from Earth, and it's just incredible to think about that. I saw the first man walk on the moon on live TV, and it's amazing to think that we got this thing up on Mars. And so it works really well for that. So here's where we get the illusion. The better the systems work, the more we think we got stuff figured out. We are not any closer to figuring stuff out than we were back in the Stone Age. So if you want to figure stuff out, you go to the Bible. And the Bible is where you can figure stuff out that's important. And the rest of the stuff is just to design systems to make us comfortable and to be able to control, to a large extent, our physical environment. But notice what happens. We control our physical environment. We're still sinners. We still screw up all the time. We still get depressed, even Christians. And so we can't fix that part with science. We take drugs that are personality changing drugs, and what happens? People commit suicide and all kinds of other problems. So, you know, science is really good for systems. And I hope that answers. I think what you're talking about is, what is science really good for, and why are we dealing so much with science? Science is really good if we stick to it, if we understand, have the right perspective on what does this mean. It doesn't mean that we have the truth. So no matter how well a system works, no matter how convincing the narrative is about here's why air conditioning works so well, and we talk about this, expansion and contraction of gases and molecules banging into each other, that's all just a made up myth. But the myth works effectively for communicating how to design air conditioning systems. Now, here's the interesting thing. The other day I told you about, yeah, it's almost time, so I'm going to have to let you go in just a minute. But the other day I told you about the geosyncline theory. Bob had asked me, you know, and I told you about this geosyncline theory that I thought was so cool, and then it came along and it was replaced by a plate tectonics theory and continental drift. Well, you know, they had to completely rewrite the geology textbooks. They had to rewrite them because they had a new narrative. But they didn't stop drilling for oil, or they didn't change the way they drilled for oil. They didn't change the way they mined coal. They just changed the narrative. So the narrative is where we explain mechanisms and where we talk about why the mechanisms work the way they do. And it's just myth. We make it up. We make it up as we go, and we change it as we go. So the mistake is to think that just because science works pretty good, that we're getting closer to figuring it out. So we're just about time to quit here. Does anybody have any final questions? So some of the Emily, do you have a question, or that was just
No, I was just going to say that.
Gallery.
Yeah, well, I didn't have a question, but I was just going to say that. Yeah, basically that you boiled my question down to a layman's terms, pretty much. But how you explained it makes sense. So, yeah. So I was just going to say that makes sense.
Okay. You know, I want to tell you though, thinking back over my journey through figuring all this stuff out, I would get to the point where I would think, you know what, I'm really on to something here. And I think that just because everybody disagrees with me doesn't mean that I'm not right, because I just can't get away from this logic. And I kept noticing that people were never attacking my logic. They were never exposing. In fact, I just invited them. Can you show me what's wrong with this logic here that has allowed me to come to this conclusion? They never talk about that. They talk about stuff like, Huffman, do you actually think that people would be publishing papers like this in the best journals in the world if they had everything all figured, if they had everything wrong? And I said, well, that's what they're doing. And but I would go through these cycles of doubting, and then I would have to sit down and think my way through this logic again. And eventually I came to realize, I got to the point where I had a lot more confidence, because the logic is bulletproof. And you just got to go over it and over it, because we've learned stuff the wrong way. And we've partially incorporated this into our worldview, and we have to get it back out of our worldview because it doesn't have any place in our worldview. And the word is where we get we should be getting our worldview. So,
Do you still
okay.
do you still teach about skepticism?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I know that you had talked a lot about how many people are not doing that because of various reasons. So I was just curious if you still did, or if not, or yeah.
Yeah, well, even I'm a skeptic even in reading the Bible, because especially when I listen to a lot of sermons. I listen to at least one sermon every day. And when they say something about the Bible, some interpretation of the Bible, I say, wait a minute, let me go check this out. And that's what Paul lauded the Bereans for. He said, the Bereans don't believe anything I say. They never believe what I say. And he was proud of them, because to check him out, they went back to the Old Testament to see if what he said could be backed up by the Old Testament. So skepticism is not a bad thing. Cynicism is, but skepticism is not. And there are several places in the Bible where we are called to be skeptics about claims about what Jesus did, or what what God says. So, well, we're way over time, and I know probably some of you have to go, and I really appreciate you joining today, and especially the regulars. And we've got some other stuff coming up and I'm going to eventually get into, I'm going to go back through the scientific method. That's what we're going to start next time. And we're going to go in detail. So I sort of covered the scientific method in that experiment. Now we're going to go back through it in detail. And we're going to talk about how we come to conclusions, and how we assign a cause and effect, how we investigate causes and effects and assign causes to the outcome of an experiment. And you'll probably be really amazed to understand how weak the connection is between a really profoundly rigorous scientific experiment and the conclusions that we draw. Okay, so that's it for today, unless you have any other questions or anybody wants to hang around. And we'll go ahead and close it out and be back together again next week, same time, same station.
Okay, I just wanted to, thank you so much for the time. It's very interesting, and I really am enjoying it. And I would like to agree with Emily's son wholeheartedly. Woo! That's all I got.
Amen. All right. Well, God bless you all, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.